Last week, we began studying what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And in the book of Matthew, we're told that after Jesus faced the temptations from the enemy, which defined the kind of Messiah that Jesus would and would not be, and after he asked his disciples to follow him, he walks up the mountainside and begins to teach. And this was at the beginning of his ministry. This was still when the crowds who had watched or heard of the healings began to gather. And certainly some of them were wondering if this miracle worker would be the Messiah that had been promised to their ancestors. The Messiah who would defeat Rome and who would rule with their idea of justice and mercy and would return all that had been lost during their exile. But the Jesus who spoke to them from the top of the mountain, the Jesus who taught and who healed and chose his followers not based on status or talent or by how they could invest in or promote his ministry, this Jesus followed his announcement that the kingdom of heaven had come near with a sermon that began by calling their values into question. Instead of telling them that in God's kingdom they will be rich, and they will have no reason to mourn, and that their land would be returned, he pointed out that the ones who were living in poverty, the ones who had experienced loss, and the ones who were working land that they didn't even own were already living the good life because they are the ones that have a front row seat to seeing God's kingdom break through into their reality. They are the rich, because they get to see God work on their behalf. The truth that Jesus is pointing out is that when we feel that we don't have a need for God, when we feel like we have control of our lives, then we're further from being able to see God working all around us. And that's a more desperate poverty than any earthly pain or loss. And this plays out in our everyday living in an affluent society, because that's really where we're at. We're at a pretty affluent society. We don't have to trust God for our daily bread all the time. So we spend our money distracting ourselves from that nagging emptiness that can't be filled with material things, the things that we pile around us. But those distractions eventually lead us further from God. In God's kingdom, wealth and prosperity and a lack of hardship are burdens because they hide the need for God that will always be there, no matter if we are the richest or the poorest person on the planet. So today we want to look at what Jesus says next. After he points out that what they value, what the world values, is not what God values, because the kingdom that Jesus is introducing is not one that would land on Rome like they wanted. Instead, it's one that's already there. But in order to see it, they and we have to allow Jesus to lift us up and transform us so that we can see our hardships and our struggles through God's eyes. Then we'll be able to see the kingdom that Jesus promises. Then we can see people and the things and the situations in light of their true value. Jesus is not going to rule from humanity's standards. Instead, he's sitting with his disciples and lifting their standards and humanity's standards up to God's standards. So at this point, Jesus has tackled the problem of what we value. But that leaves us with the problem of how we are transformed so that we can see true value as God does, or closer to as God does, right? We'll never see it like God does. Not right now. Because unless we have allowed Jesus to transform us, we're still in the same place that these first listeners were. We're still just hoping to see victory on our terms. So to do this, Jesus moves on to describe not how it is that we are transformed, like a to-do list, but instead he describes the character of the transformed person so that we can recognize them. What is the person like who can perceive the kingdom of heaven? And not just perceive it now, but who will see the new Eden when God has finished this work of redemption. If that transformed person doesn't value success as the world defines success, and if they don't chase wealth and power and influence, then what does that transformed person even want? And in Matthew 5:6, Jesus begins to answer this question. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Like the three statements that we covered last week, this one and the ones that follow begin with the blessed are phrase. That isn't calling us to figure out how to hunger or thirst for righteousness so that we can be filled, but instead it communicates the state of those who already live seeking righteousness. They will be filled because they're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. He's saying that if you are one of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, then you are already blessed. You are already living the good life. So this leaves us with the question of how. How does hungering and thirsting for anything, let alone righteousness, mean that we're already blessed? Now, we've talked about this word righteousness before because it's one that we know, but if we're honest, if we're asked to define it, we might have some trouble, like on the spot. We might be able to think about it a little bit. But that's because there are a lot of ways that we can understand the word righteousness, and all of them are examples in the Bible that we can point to. We can think of righteousness as right behavior, as recognizing what God has done for us, so we act in a way that does not corrupt the blessing that we carry. That's probably the most common understanding. We see Jesus' sacrifice, and we know that our sin placed him on the cross. So when we understand this, we choose to avoid sin as much as possible. Another way, though, to understand righteousness is to accept that it can mean social justice that we should be working for in our present time. There are a number of examples of this use of the word in the Bible. Or we can understand righteousness to mean the justice that God will institute when God's work of redemption is completed on this earth. There's also the understanding of that righteousness is what happens when God's people are vindicated. That's in the Bible too. Or we can understand it in a way that recognizes that we have been made right, or we have been justified through the blood of Jesus. Or there's the possibility that the definition combines all of those. And I think that this is probably a good way to understand what Jesus means when he uses the word righteousness. Because in the same sentence, he tells us that we should hunger and thirst for it. And if we're reflecting God's goodness on this earth, we should hunger and thirst for all of those definitions of righteousness. We should hunger and thirst for the ability to live in God's blessings. We should hunger and thirst for justice in this world. We should hunger and thirst for vindication of the oppressed. And we should hunger and thirst for our own redemption. We should long for all of these. You see, the words hunger and thirst call us to remember that justice and redemption are not just what we hope to see. They are needs, like food and water are needs. And being created in the image of our God, when we reflect the desire for God's righteousness to be known, we are reflecting the heart of our God. We are reminded by the prophet Amos in Amos 5:23-24, away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. I'm going to read that again. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. We read all over the Bible that God longs for our worship, that he longs for evidence that he has been seen. But I think even more than that, he longs for righteousness. He longs for us to be transformed into his justice-minded people so that we can be in unity with him. In the first 3 blessed are statements, we're given examples of people who are in need. They are impoverished. They need comfort, and they are afflicted. And it's the state of this need that gives them a window to see God at work. And here we see another need, hunger and thirst. The thing about hunger and thirst, though, is that they're immediate needs. They don't wait. They have to be resolved. The hungry person will think of nothing until they have eaten. And even more so for the one who's thirsty. In the first 3 statements, we see that Jesus is telling his disciples that their values are out of sync with what God values. Here we see needs like before, and arguably even greater needs, hunger and thirst. But instead of saying, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they will be filled," Jesus takes that negative need and makes the state of needing into a positive by pointing to the one thing that's worthy of our efforts, worthy of our longing, God's righteousness. Jesus is telling them that the needs that they are so familiar with are part of what draw us to God. Hunger and thirst are needs that could be used to manipulate us. But if we're willing to let God take that negative and reorient our understanding off of us and in a way that points us to the bread of life, to God, if we're willing to follow the need that is in our DNA and not get distracted by only what is feeding the body, but instead continue to follow it until our soul is also satisfied, then we have the path. A lot like Jesus rejecting the temptation of bread in the desert. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are those who don't stop at bread and water, but instead long to see the evidence of God's righteousness at work. They look out and see the broken world, the injustices, and they hunger and they thirst. They are dissatisfied in their core because they know there is an answer, but that answer is beyond their own limited and mistaken sense of justice. So they hunger and thirst for the time when redemption will be complete. They hunger and thirst for when this will all be put to rights. They hunger and thirst for when God brings complete justice to his broken creation. But hunger and thirst are immediate needs, right? If I'm hungry and thirsty, I can't just say I'll eat and drink when the world is put to rights. I have to do something about it now. So blessed is the person who hungers and thirsts for righteousness so thoroughly that they have to act now. They have to be part of what God is doing. Their dissatisfaction with the pain and the mourning and the injustice drives them to become part of the solution. And when we partner with God like this, then we are filled. We are taking the role we were created to take. We aren't victim to the pain around us because we move in our God-given power and authority to right the wrongs, to feed and comfort the individuals that God has placed in our path. The person who is blessed through hunger and thirst is the person who is drawn into their purpose, and the person who doesn't just believe that the kingdom is at hand, but sees the kingdom revealed as their character is transformed into the person that God can work with so that others can see the promise of God's righteousness in the here and now. So the first character trait is hunger. It's a need to see God at work. It's a longing for the future when all of this will be put to rights that is so strong. That longing is so strong that we work to see some of it now. And in that, we will be filled. If there's anything that this past year of ministry in this church has demonstrated, it's the power of seeing God at work in our lives. When you pray and the prayer is answered, man, there's nothing like that. When you need to see God at work and he shows up in the hands and feet of your neighbor, God's righteousness.
That's what it's all about.
So those of us who embrace that dissatisfaction in a way that demands a response are blessed because we have a front row seat to seeing God's righteousness. But that hunger and thirst, they have to be tempered, right? We can't just blow through situations demanding that what we think should happen now needs to be done right now. We can't just assume that we are perceiving injustices in the same way God is. That's a work of discernment. We can't just be baby Christians demanding the bottle that we want despite what anybody else around us feels or is trying to accomplish. So Jesus gives us another character trait of the person who's living the good life. And this one, in my opinion, is a maturing character trait. Matthew 5:7 tells us, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." Now here there's a change. The first 4 blessed are statements were about needs. 3 that dealt with what we value, and then it turns the last one is about character. But our character is not all based on our needs because our needs need to be tempered with God's character, or we will never be able to be the hands and feet of Jesus. So the first character trait is linked to what we need. It's linked to what drives us as human beings. It's a desire for righteousness that sets the stage for the maturing traits. It's the merciful who will receive mercy. And let's be honest, being merciful isn't easy. There we go. It's only possible with maturity. Those kids in the nursery, they're not merciful when they think someone took their toy and an injustice has been perpetrated on them. When we get older, we tend to hide it a little better. Sometimes we even make it about God, right? If we're being honest. And we say that we're standing up for what we believe, and we put on a little bit of righteous indignation, which is really just our pride and our need to be right with a sheen of religion, if we're going to be honest. Got your boots on, Tim? All right. And we conveniently forget that our anger does not produce God's righteousness. The fact is, we can't be merciful in our own power. That's why it's a character issue. We have to learn mercy from God. We can act mercifully sometimes, but this verse isn't telling us to act mercifully. It's telling us to be merciful. There's a big difference. The hunger and the thirst make us long for God, but opening up to allow that hunger and thirst to be tempered by God's mercy is where God begins to teach us more than the law could. You see, in the Old Testament, the concept of mercy was very important, and there were tons of laws that told people what they could do so that they could practice mercy. But when Jesus came, the law was fulfilled. It stopped being about acting in the right ways so we could just get a gold star on our chart or a jewel in our crown at the end. Instead, it became about who we are now. It became about who we are now. In Matthew 23:23-24, Jesus deals with the Pharisees who want their religion and their success to be based on what they do instead of who they are. And Jesus says to them, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." That's coming out of the gate pretty strong. "For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others, you blind guides." You strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Whew. Our God is merciful. When we experience our God and when we invite Jesus in, we have a choice. Will we be transformed into merciful people, into a people who see the needs that others may not see and then respond in ways that others may not respond? Having mercy on others is demonstrating our loyalty to God because it is where we begin to allow our inner transformation to influence our actions. It's no longer about my ruffled sense of justice, but it's about embracing what breaks God's heart. And when we do that, when we are being shaped into the image of God we were created to reflect, and when we are acting as Jesus' hands and feet, seeing and alleviating another person's distress, not because it'll pay us back, but because it is who we are, we're reflecting God's goodness, and it is then that we're getting to the heart of the matter. Here's where our character starts to be matured. In Matthew 5:8, Jesus gives us the next truth. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. They will see God. One commentary tells us that someone who is pure in heart, they define it for us, is someone whose mind, will, and desire have been purged of all other influences and are purely dedicated to God. Pure in heart isn't about the outcome. It's about the motivation. And the miracle is, when we align with the right motivation, God gives us strength for the kind of outcome that God desires. When we align with the right motivation, God gives us the strength needed for the outcome that God desires. To be pure in heart doesn't mean that we're perfect. It means that we know we can't be perfect, so we lean into Jesus not just to be the author of our faith, but as Hebrews 12:2 says, the author and finisher of our faith. The work is only complete through Jesus, the cross and the empty grave. Jesus, the cross and the empty grave. Being pure in heart is a lifelong pursuit, a lifetime of being honest with ourselves, a lifetime of separating out our desires and instead choosing God's, because we know and we have seen and we have faced the consequences of following our own desires. We know that without Jesus, our efforts are a dead end. And in following that path, we will eventually come to the end of ourselves. Here's the thing. Following our desires leads us to hell. That's what it does. We want freedom. We want to be able to do what we want to do. We want to be free to numb the loneliness or the pain in any way we see fit. We want to be free to entertain ourselves in any way we want. So we push away the restraints and follow our desires right into addiction or into unhealthy relationships or into choices that cost us dearly. Really, following the desire for freedom is what leads us straight into a prison of our own making, if not actual prison. So Jesus, sitting on top of the mountain, reorders his disciples' values, and then because they can now see the values of this reordered kingdom that Jesus is introducing, because they are beginning to trade in the things they value for the things that God values, Jesus takes the next step and starts to write God's character all over their hearts. Their faith is no longer about what they do, it's about who they're becoming. And their growing hunger for God's righteousness means that they are becoming a people who are merciful, not a people who are merely act mercifully, but a people who are, at their very core, driven to mercy for others because of the mercy that has been given to them. And then as they continue to seek God, as they continue to go through the refining process, the old is washed away. The desires that drive us to death are traded in for God's desires. And we emerge as the people who are pure in heart, who are united, and those whom God can work with. And then we are numbered with those who will seek God. You see, heaven isn't just something we earn. It's the fulfillment of what we've been working for our entire lives. Psalm 27:4 reads, "One thing I asked of the Lord that I will seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and behold the beauty of the Lord and inquire in his temple." The pure in heart longs to see the face of God. They long to go home, but they long for it so much that they will be the instruments that drag that goodness into the here and now. They have seen the bits and pieces of the kingdom. They have seen the breakthroughs of God's goodness, and they have walked through the pain and the loneliness to the end of themselves as they have sought ways to fix it in their own power. And they finally come to the place where their hunger is satisfied and where they see the cost of the mercy that they have been offered. And their desires have been rewritten, and they realize that there is nothing better in life than to see the face of their God.